Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, these are the Welcome to Geektown interviews. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. We're back after an extended break from new episodes with the first official entry in the new iteration of the Welcome to Geektown podcast. Instead of answering questions, I'll be asking them now, as I interview comic book professionals and hopefully other people who are residents of Geektown in one way or another as the show continues. For the inaugural episode, I reached out to my personal favorite comic book artist of all time, Darick Robertson, and he graciously agreed. We spent about 2.5 hours talking about his career. Even after cutting out some technical issues and other extraneous bits, that's still quite the long talk, so I'm splitting it into multiple parts. The first section, starting in a couple minutes, goes from his early influences, then into his first published work on his creator-owned book, Space Beaver, at the age of 16, and finally into his first work at DC and Marvel. Before we get into all that, I do want to send a special shout-out to my patrons, who have mostly stuck with me during my hiatus. They have access to an uncut version of this portion of the interview, and you can listen to that as well for just $1 per month. In later sections, I will have to cut some pieces out even of the patron-only section at Darick's request. Thank you again to my current patrons: Mike Sterling, Justin Bailey, Lily and Sam Breen, Jesse Clark, Ricky Garvin, Aaron Borst, Carla Hoffman, Julio Herrera, and Matthew Saint. Your continued support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's get started with the interview. Ladies and gentlemen, Eisner-nominated artist, co-creator of The Boys, and again, my personal favorite comic book artist of all time, Darick Robertson. Well, then let's get started. And in fact, let's start all the way at the very beginning of your comic book journey.
Oh, why? Why? Everybody wants to talk about this, and it's like, it's so well tread.
Yeah, but do you remember the first comic you read, or like the first one that made you say, I want to do this?
Yeah, that's a different story. I thought we were going to talk about Space Beaver, and then I was going
We'll get there in a sec.
Yeah, no, the first comic I remember reading that really, well, the one that my experience with comics was a really strange journey in that I liked them, of course, but everybody saw that I liked to draw. I think the first thing I had learned to draw was Looney Tunes and Peanuts characters. I could draw Snoopy on top of the doghouse with his, World War One fighter pilot helmet. Like, I love that, and I would draw that for people, and everybody would be like, "Oh, look, you can do this." But I mean, I was really little, like 3 or 4, and I was drawing pretty good Snoopy and Tweety Bird, and kind of learned how to draw those things. And so people started to just give me comics, and so I would just get random stacks. Like my dad's barber, he would keep them like they were just old magazines. And so I'd go in, my dad would go in and get his haircut, and I'd be waiting to get mine. And he'd just give me I'd be going through all his comics. He had a waiting area, and then there was like a shelf above it, and I would just get up there and go through that, and he'd go, "Oh, just take them, they be doing me a favor." So I just start picking random comics, and they'd be like Gold Key comics with Bugs Bunny or Little Monsters and stuff like that. And then my sister liked Harvey comics, so she was reading like Richie Rich and Casper and Little Hot Stuff and those characters, and I like those as well. And then she was reading Archie and romance comics, which I wouldn't know until much later that those romance comics were actually drawn by a lot of the mainstream Marvel artists at the time. So they looked really good to me and interesting. And so even though I didn't care one way or the other about the romance element of the story, I would read them anyway because I just like sequential storytelling. And I'm really glad that I did because it imprinted on me very young the idea that you can make a quiet scene interesting visually. And a lot of Archie was like that too. It wasn't people punching each other. It was like him trying to get his car started or doing something
Yeah.
silly, like eating too many
Hmm.
hamburgers. So I read that stuff, but then it was like in 1978, when I was about 9 or 10, I started to outgrow those and get interested more and more in superhero comics. And a lot of it had to do with Star Wars and Superman the movie. And so I remember one comic that really made a huge impact on me was Superman versus Muhammad Ali,
Oh, yeah. Neil
because the
Adams.
incredible artwork and a great
Yeah.
story too. I actually reread that recently and like was impressed with like how like when Superman gets beaten and then like Muhammad Ali's like stay away from him. It was like really powerful, like how they kind of teamed up and like they had to fight each other, but Superman proves that he's just got this fighting spirit. Really good stuff. And
Hmm.
even without his powers, and I like often say, like, Superman's greatest ability is like who he is. It's not what he wears or what he can do. It's how he controls himself. And because God, the man is. You can imagine if you were just careless, you'd just be shattering people accidentally.
Yeah, there's
Um,
that great speech in the final season of Justice League Unlimited where he talks about how the whole world is cardboard to him.
yeah,
And
exactly.
then finally with Darkseid, he could actually let go and fight at his own level.
Yeah, that's crazy. I love that. So anyway, that got me into more and more. And then Jose Garcia Lopez, just phenomenal artist. Any cover he would do, and he was doing a lot of DC covers at the time, just
Uh-huh.
reached out and grabbed my eyes. And the one that really got me going was a cover for The Flash, number 272. And there's nothing special about that issue. It's actually kind of a dumb story. He's fighting a clown that can manipulate people with a like magic calliope, and it's kind of a goofy period for the Flash. But I'm 9, and it's I don't know what a good comic is from a bad comic at that point. I just know what I like.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
and this cover just like the sky was purple, but Jose Garcia Lopez drew this Flash at an angle that I could just see all of his muscles and the foreshortening. And it
Mm.
was an interesting layout because even to this day, I'd have a hard time laying out something. If somebody told me to draw this, I would have a hard time figuring out this composition as well as Jose did, because there's like a clown it's like a ground angle. The clown is in the background, but these guys that are up on these wires on a unicycle for three balancing, and they're clearly not circus performers. They're going to die, and they're on power lines. And the Flash is frozen in space,
Right.
and like he can't move. He's paralyzed by this music. There's just something really cool about I love a good image that will show you a whole story in one image. I loved Frank Frazetta posters and Boris Vallejo posters when I was growing up, and album covers that would just have an evocative image on it that would sort of like bring you in, and you figure out. I love Norman Rockwell too. Like Norman Rockwell images were phenomenal to me because you could get a whole story in just one picture,
Yeah.
and that to me is a real art form in itself. And what's really cool about that is if you're good at it, it doesn't matter how well you draw. It just matters, can you convey a feeling, an emotion, or an image, or draw your audience in. So that comic got me interested, and I got it, and it was like really cool seeing the Flash in like almost like a Mooey Bridge sequence of running,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
and where each shot of him was like a different shot of him in a state of running, but you could follow it with your eye, and you got the sense of him moving really fast, and that was really cool to me because I hadn't quite seen that in that's not the kind of thing you'd see in Archie or Richie Rich, you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
And so that was like a first kind of a wake up of like, ooh, what you can do with sequential art and how sequential art can bring a dynamic thing to life. I think it was Rich Buckler that drew that issue. And, he did a great job and just kind of like made me want to keep reading The Flash. The Flash became my favorite superhero, and you couldn't get any toys of him or anything. He was kind of made him even cooler because he was sort of like this fringe superhero in the DC universe. You could get Amigo of all the rest, but it would be years before they put out a proper Amigo Flash, which I did buy. So it's right there. And so the fact that they put it out with a proper Migo logo and it looks just like the one I would have had if I had gotten this as a kid kind of thrills me. So
Nice.
I keep him just for the joy of having the thing I didn't get as a kid. But I tried to make my own. I took a Captain America and painted his head, customized my own, put a Shazam suit on him. But I used the wrong kind of paint because I didn't know what kind of paint you're supposed to use. Again, kid. And so it was like this sticky model paint that never quite dried on rubber.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it was
Yeah.
always smudged up with dirt attached to it. So it
Probably
was a
fingerprints all over.
yeah, totally. It was a
Yeah.
complete disaster. And but I had a Flash figure and that was enough for me. But anyhow, but that was my first foray into collecting comics. I started picking up the Flash every month, and as a result,
Hmm.
I started these incredible covers. That was a really good run for the covers. Dick Giordano was inking Jose Garcia Lopez, or he'd be doing them himself. And he was, Dick Giordano was an incredibly good artist. I'm very underrated. And they were, again, every cover was kind of interesting. And that's actually one of the things I loved about, I started, it would be because I wouldn't know what happened before issue 272 with the Flash.
Hmm.
So the whole world of the Flash just kind of started in the middle of the story for me. But then one day we were out at Pier 39 in San Francisco a long, long time ago, back in 81, maybe 80. And went to the first comic book store I'd ever been into and discovered that there were back issues, which I didn't know people kept. Because, like I said, my whole experience with comics is I got them in a stack and they'd be just random numbers, and you just have to figure out what was happening. And I really loved those little boxes that would go issue 275,
Right.
like editor.
All
And
the editor's
yeah,
notes.
the
Yeah.
editors, and I love that. And I'm like, oh, thank you for telling me where I can find out that happened, or the recaps. Yeah, so, but I found issue 271 of The Flash, which was the one right before the very first one I had ever bought. And he's standing there in front of a mirror with a bunch of rocks stuck in him, the Flash is. And because, like, when he vibrates through
Hmm.
things and something went wrong, and he's like, remarkably not in pain, but he's like, how am I going to explain this to Iris? And I love that kind of goofiness from that era. It's like there's something like I'm gonna at some point do a comic where I can do those kind of covers. I really want really like the Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane covers or Jimmy
Right.
Olsen,
Yeah.
or they were so outrageous. But the Flash had some amazing ones where it's like his head's super large, or
Yeah. Yeah.
he's turned it into a
Into a
puppet.
marionette. Yeah.
Yeah, or he's progressively getting obese as he's running, like it's just hilarious. Like those covers were so creative. It's still one of my favorites ever is him like talking to the camera going, "Stop, don't pass up this issue or I'll die."
Yeah. Yeah. I've
Brilliant. I
I've
just I
seen
just
all
loved it.
those. Those are classics.
Talk talk about jumping, like just jumping out of this off the stand at you.
Yeah.
So I love the Flash and those, even as goofy as they got, because it was not a great era for the writing. But I remember the biggest dilemma, like the story was going between the Flash trying to solve this weird case, and then Iris worried, like sitting around wondering whether or not Barry still loves her. That's like all her life was. So she
Right.
had nothing
Yeah.
going on outside of like, oh, Barry's cheating on me, and
He's
he
always
wasn't.
late.
Right.
He must
I
be
love
off.
that. Having an affair. Like I
Yeah.
like Iris as the reporter much more. So anyway, but that was my first foray into comics, and getting back issues of that particular line made me start collecting. And I still like that's still the only comic book I still want to complete that 400 issue run. Like someday when I'm super wealthy, I'll get Showcase number one, but that day is not today.
Well, Showcase number 4 was his first appearance, right?
Yes, when I say number one, I mean the first appearance of the Flash.
Yeah, yeah.
Geek.
Yes. Now, from what I understand, you're almost entirely self-taught in your art.
Yeah, well, I would say, yeah, 99%. I had a brief interaction with my high school art teacher was a guy named Stan Grossi who did professional gallery art. He was a fine artist, and I don't know, maybe he just needed the money or what, but I was lucky that he actually taught high school for a couple of years that I was going, and he was great about kind of grabbing my head and going, focus on this. But I only wanted to draw comics. And so I remember one day I brought in an Art of John Byrne collection, and I thought, wow, I'm really going to impress him with this. This is like 1982 or 83. And he looked at it and he was like, yeah, well, it's okay. And I'm like, how can you say it's just okay? That's phenomenal, you know? And he said, well, her head's too big. And if you look, it's like off the shoulders here, like this is where the spine is. And he was right. And I suddenly could see what I couldn't see before.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then I'd take my own drawings and what I was attempting to do. And he one day, like I had this character that I created, and he was kind of in a squat pose holding a sword. And he kind of like showed me, oh, look, well, you're drawing the arms and they're kind of like lumps, but this actually all intertwines. And I thought, oh, okay. So I started looking at anatomy, and he kind of showed me, like, I go, how do you draw hair? And he showed me the patterns of hair, and it started to make sense to me.
Uh-huh.
But to say that he instructed me would be kind of a step too far, but he did encourage me to like really, he goes, look, whatever you do, be an artist, don't be a half-baked cartoonist. Like put the work in, like learn how to draw, learn how to do. And I wanted to paint. So when I first got into making art at all, I wanted to be Frank Frazetta and make these incredible fantasy posters. And so I tried fantasy art for a little while. And this is when I was like 13. And I did some terrible, terrible paintings. But what was funny is that I learned really quickly that in order to paint well, you need to draw well. And because I couldn't draw, I focused on learning to draw in black and white. And that kind of just took me right down to where I am today. Like I kind of bailed on painting altogether. Every once in a while I'll dabble, but I just totally gave up on being a fantasy painter. Someday I kind of want to do some fantasy paintings again, but just because now I can draw, maybe I can do a decent fantasy painting, but it's just not I'm much happier working in ink.
Speaking of working in ink, I'm curious, technology has changed the way comics are made a whole lot.
Yeah.
Do you still work on like Bristol board, or has a lot of it gone digital for you?
No, this is right on my board at the moment. So that's me drawing in blue pencil, getting it prepared for ink. But I also now use my iPad and Photoshop to finish scanned art and dropping in Zipatone and things
Uh-huh.
like that I used to have to do manually as a kid. I can now do digitally, so I can get the effect that I wanted without having to spend money on Zipatone, which was very expensive back in the day. So it's sort of like I marry the two forms now to get the effect I want. I'll drop in shading, or like I'll take I got a whole library of my own pictures of the sky, and then I'll digitize those clouds. And I like to drop that kind of stuff in rather than draw the clouds in ink, because it makes the panels look more dimensional. Like
Yeah.
there's a better sense of the foreground popping and the background fading away. And it's competitive now. You're if your art's not interesting or dynamic, I don't know why anybody would pick it up, because the competition compared to where things were when I was a kid is dramatically more vast. Everybody gets on stage now, and my competition were the guys that were cranking it out, because literally some of them were either working on greeting cards or drawing comic books.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't considered an art form. It was considered low art. in the 60s and 70s when I was getting into it, or what I was absorbing. And so people were just kind of doing a job. Of course, there were the luminaries that stood out, like Kirby and those guys, but a lot of those artists at the time, you'll see a lot of forgotten names that were just pumping out comics to make comics and make a buck. But it has changed so much since then that now it just like my generation coming up, there's another generation coming up behind me that loves comics in a whole other way. But now you can work on, you can do things digitally. It's much more affordable.
Absolutely. It's more affordable. And now with email and fax and, and all that sort of stuff, you can have
You
artists.
said
I
facts.
did, but, you can have artists from all around the world
Yeah, it's
competing
true.
for jobs that were basically just New York.
No, that's absolutely true. I did live in New York for a short while, and it made a big difference in my career. I spent a few years there, and when you could go in the office and make personal relationships with people, it really does imprint you on them as a human being. But right now, but we're back to a digital world again, where DC up and moved out of New York entirely. Marvel's still there, but it's also in LA and a part of Disney now. And the good news is that I spent a lot of time over in Europe, and I'm going to be setting up a studio in Italy so I can work from abroad. And when I was there in 1997, it was a very, very different world. I was working on Transmetropolitan at the time, and I had to find a place that would make Xerox copies of my pages
Right.
and then get them to a DHL guy, and it was very specific. If you missed them, boy, it could be up to 2 days before you got another shot to send it. And email was brand new, and it was a whole other experience that compared to now, I'm going to be able, like Italy actually has really good Wi-Fi and that kind of infrastructure because they got into it before even America was fully embracing it because their phone system sucks so bad. Everybody had a cell phone, and because everybody had a cell phone, it developed the Wi-Fi. So now I'm going to be able to do, as long as I got a good Wi-Fi connection and I can upload to a server and I have a scanner,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of all I need. My art stays in the studio, and I can do what I do from abroad pretty much the way I do it here. So I'm kind of excited that I'll get to kind of go back and experience that world of living. I have friends in Italy, and I'm very comfortable
Nice.
there. And I can live there and kind of live my same lifestyle and keep my work on time, hopefully, and produce from abroad the same way that I work here. So that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah, we were talking a little bit about that before we arranged this interview.
Yeah.
Sounds like something you'll be really happy doing. So that's great. I'm really happy for you. Are you buying like one of those dollar houses that they put up
No,
that
no. No. We rented an apartment. But we got a nice place for a remarkably good price. But no, we're thinking about that down the road, but not anytime soon. One of the things I would highly recommend anybody who's thinking about relocating is go live there for a little while when you can get out easily, because it's not a vacation. It's a real world with real people doing real life stuff, and lifestyle may not suit you. It's like I read an article from a woman who moved like up and moved to Spain, and then was surprised every day wasn't a vacation. Literally complained about the weather. I'm like, if you don't know what the weather's like in a place and you're moving there, that's on you.
yeah, that's your bad.
If you're Yeah, if you're not prepared for things to get cold, then you live a very privileged life.
Now, let's go back into your history a little bit more.
Okay.
You weren't quite as young as like a Jim Shooter was, but you still got into self-publishing. You still got published right away at a very young age.
I was almost the same age as Jim Shooter.
Well, yeah,
I was 16 working on my first issue of
yeah,
my first published comic. So
yeah. I mean, he was 14. There's just a couple of years
that that
difference
is
there, but
that is younger.
so tell me how Space Beaver did come about.
It was more of a fluke for me. I did not intend for Space Beaver to be my first published work. I had created Space Beaver in summer school, and I was just entertaining myself as I would do at that age, where I would just come up with a silly idea and I'd chase it. And so I was just writing and drawing my Space Beaver story for fun, making it up panel by panel. The first 8, 9 pages of Space Beaver, you can see that. I mean, it's pretty much what I made in summer school. I didn't really change much, but it was, I didn't know how to use professional materials. I happened to be lucky enough to meet a security guard that worked at my after school job. And he was sketching in a book, and I looked over his shoulder and was really impressed. He had done all these incredible manga illustrations in his sketchbook, and they were really solid. And I was like, whoa, that's great. I draw. We started talking. He was in his 20s, and his name is Michio Okamura. He now works in video games, but he, like me, was just, working a job and doing his art. But turned out he was an inker on a small book from a company called Viz. He worked on a manga style comics called Shuriken, and he was the inker on that. And so he invited me over to his house, and I met his wife. She was pregnant. Really nice couple, and they were really kind to me. And I brought over all my sketchbooks and stuff, and he was looking through my stuff, and he found this Space Beaver story. Now, this was 1984, 85, so the Ninja Turtles had just broken out huge. And as a result, my first bubble that I didn't know was happening, I would experience, which was the black and white boom of the mid 80s. And after Ninja Turtles hit huge, everybody was looking for the next one. And so publishers were cropping up just to put out these black and white books of varying degrees of quality. There literally was a book called Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters,
Yep.
and stuff like that. So that's about as thinly veiled as you get. But in the midst of all that, I actually had no idea any of that was happening. My focus, I was aware of the Ninja Turtles, but I wasn't like into them. They were all in the red mask at the time still. I thought they were cool, but I couldn't tell one from the other, that they're weapons.
Mm-hmm.
But ironically, I discovered in my stuff, I have a number 1, the old Mirage #1 Ninja Turtles in my collection. Yeah. I held on to everything. So, but as a result, I was really into Rocket Raccoon by Mike Mignola and Bill Mantlo at the time.
Right. Yeah.
They did a 4-issue miniseries that Mignola drew in his early days, and it was just great. And because it was Mike Mignola, he was always good. And then but his style was slightly different. It wasn't quite as black and white and chunky as it would become.
Mm-hmm.
But I loved it, and that really got me going. And also I loved Captain Carrot and the Amazing Zoo Crew, and I liked it because of the absurdity of it. And I love Scott Shaw's art so much that those characters just spoke to me, and I thought they were great. And somewhere in my stuff, I have a Scott Shaw Space Beaver. That stuff really inspired me. So Space Beaver came about of me just thinking of the name. And then I have a very dark sense of humor. You might not know that from my work, but
no,
I know it's startling. It's true, but I love the idea of funny animals being really dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's something silly to me about like a cute animal, but really angry or really heartbroken, or, and if they got into real battles, like, blood and guts coming out of them, and, rather than, because they look like teddy bears, but then they're exploding, brains are flying, and that just tickles me. To this day, if I see something like that, it'll tickle me pink. So that was all it was. It was just, for me, I was literally just off on a lark based on the name. It popped into my head one day, and I just, I wanted to make my own Rocket Raccoon, basically, and Space Beaver came. I like beavers. I like space stuff. And so it was just obvious. I never thought it was going to be anything more than to entertain myself, but this is where Michio comes in. So Michio liked my Space Beaver story, and he sent copies of it to his publisher, who was going to put out a black and white book, and said, we can't pay you, but we'll run it as a backup feature in this other comic. And I was, a kid. So I was like, wow, I'll get published. Great.
Yeah.
My dream of having a real comic book with my stuff in it was just like, wow, and then the whole, we won't pay you part just went over my head. So I started working very hard and learning very quickly how to make proper comic book pages on full-size paper with Bristol board and proper ink pens. I bought a set of Koh-i-Noor technical pens and went to it. I was using Zipatone, all that stuff you see in the first Space Beaver issue was me learning on the job. I was maybe about 10, 12 pages into it when I took it to my local comic book shop at the time in Belmont, California. And it turned out that the store owner was ready to get on that same black and white comic book bandwagon. And so he said, and bless his heart, like Tibor Sardi, he's a good dude. And he was like, hey, I'll publish you. And, it was a total, like nobody knew what they were doing, but he was like, I'll publish your comic and, you'll make some money. And, I was like, okay. Again, contracts, who are those for?
Yeah.
Gabe paid me in comics, literally. And but it was but it forced me to kind of step up and do a book. And so at 17 years old, out comes my comic book. And it came out with all the fanfare of a wet fart at a funeral, but because the comic book black and white industry had just reached peak capacity and
Right.
pop went the bubble.
Yeah.
So we were about on it, and I didn't know what I was doing. I was writing and drawing, and I ran out of the money. I needed to do Zipatone. So like halfway through the issue, I started doing these ink washes because I had seen Gene Colan's Howard the Duck pages from the Howard the Duck magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And they were these beautifully, and I wasn't bad at ink wash. I was, like I said, I wanted to be a painter, so I could do sepia tone and ink wash pretty well for a kid. And I thought, well, this looks good. It's not Zipatone, but it is tone. Gave it 3D. Printed like garbage. It looked like it looked terrible because the printer didn't know what they were trying, what I was trying to go for. And
Right.
so they just printed it black. They just printed it black and white. And so all the gradation went, and it looks like I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't, but I kind of did. And but the original art is long lost to history. And so that was my experience where I quickly learned by the second issue, cross-hatching is your friend. And so you'll see the art make a jump pretty dramatically from issue 1 to issue 2, where I started learning to crosshatch. By issue 3, issue 4, I kind of got the hang of it. By issue 5, I think I had a pretty good rhythm and started to really figure out what I was doing. But again, I didn't know what I was doing with the characters or where the story was going to go because I never thought I'd be published. So I just it started out as something fun. And then I very quickly started taking it very seriously because I was being published and there was like people reading it. And
Yeah.
I have to make something good out of this, but it was still Space Beaver. But but it was a good experience. I learned to do stuff. And the best part that came from it is the world respects a doer.
Right.
And there's something really beautiful about any kid that can just make his own thing and get it out there and is hustling and trying. You got to kind of look at somebody with that ethic and go, hey man, you're doing something. At least you're trying to make something. So I got a lot of that kind of respect and pats on the head from other professionals. I'd go to conventions and get sat next to Jim Lee and Eric Larson and those guys back in the day, and I'd ask them questions and like, hey, how did you do this and how do you do that and what do you think of this? And and some of them were really helpful. Like they were really kind enough to sit down and give me some good honest feedback. Editors especially back in the day, because little cons, most conventions you'd go to, like the editors were there and you could just walk up and chat with them and kind of show them your stuff. They'd remember you. And I remember Tom DeFalco like kind of tearing up my Spider-Man pages and telling me what was wrong with them. And then later on, I came back with better ones and he's like, oh, good, you're doing this much better. And Mike Carlin gave me great advice. And later on, I would end up getting hired by Mike Carlin. I would end up working with Tom DeFalco. Tom DeFalco would be my editor-in-chief when I did New Warriors.
Mm-hmm.
So, but these were in my fledgling years between, 18 and 21, where I always had it in my mind I would someday work at Marvel and DC if I got really lucky. And you know,
And sure
I've done a
enough, you
lot of work
did.
for Marvel and DC. Although the harder I work, the luckier I get.
Well, that's how it works. Luck is being prepared at the right time.
Yeah, luck benefits what was it, the prepared?
Yeah.
Yes,
So let's get started into your work for the big two. You
yes.
got a run on Justice League Europe.
Yeah, that was surprising because it was the book I would have wanted to work my way up to. But I, for both companies, I got to hit the ground at the top level of where I wanted to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
How I got that, I'll never know. But I had an agent briefly in the '80s, and they took my stuff to New York for me, and and Andy Helfer really liked my Child's Play. I did a Child's Play 2 comic with
Okay.
Chucky
Yeah.
for innovation. And I'd done a few things for innovation, but Child's Play 2 was the standout. And outside of Space Beaver, that was like kind of my only notable work. I did a brief 4-issue thing that's really obscure called Apache Dick, which was a spin-off of The Trouble with Girls by Will Jacobs and Gerard Jones back in the day. But that was the only human stuff I had drawn that got published. But the Chucky really stood out as my first color comic, more than one issue, and that stuff got me on the radar. And they gave me a tryout and rolled the dice on me. And I did like a couple of I did a Justice League Quarterly with J.M. DeMatteis writing, and that was John Beatty inking me. So it was a really great first thing to have published. One, it was a really fun story written by DeMatteis at the height of his Justice League run.
Yep.
And I was a huge Maguire and a huge Adam Hughes fan. So, anything to like kind of channel them into my work. I love doing the facial expressions. I was a big fan of Brian Bolland's Camelot 3000, and he's very underrated for what great facial expressions he can do. And I love that. I love when the characters can really perform. That's kind of going back to like what I got from also with like Archie and, some of that early stuff. Even though it was simple, they emoted and you could really follow their emotions in the story.
Yeah.
Will Eisner and those guys all, they really, a lot of the mainstream stuff in those days was very generic. Everybody had like 3 expressions, and it was like, stern, happy, and then really angry, and that was about all you had. But like guys like Maguire and Bolland and like and Byrne, like they would do these subtle expressions, and I really was intrigued by that, because if you could really understand what the character was feeling, then you could relate to the character better, and it would bring you into the story deeper. But if you were just wanting to watch. I love George Perez's Teen Titans too.
Oh, absolutely.
The same way. And Neil Adams could make his characters perform really well. And I always remember that Green Lantern, Green Arrow story where he's talking to the black man, and then he hangs his head in shame because he's let this guy down.
Mm-hmm.
Really good stuff. So that really influenced me going in. So by the time I got my chance at Justice League, I was kind of ready to bring my whatever I could do. And it's still an issue that I look back on pretty proudly. I can go, well, that wasn't a bad debut for a kid, So that was and then they liked that enough. They gave me a couple annual short stories, and then they assigned me a 6-issue run on Justice League Europe. So then again with Gerard Jones.
Yeah, and then you were working with Keith Giffen breakdowns, right?
Yeah, in the beginning. And Keith was wonderful to learn from. But what I liked best about it was Keith was not precious about him. He just said, this is just how I tell the story, and it's easier for me to draw it out than write it out. And he and JM were working, on a story together.
Yeah.
So I would get handed them, but they said, if you want to change things, feel free. I'm not going to hold you to this. And the editor was the same way. So I started breaking panels and changing layouts, and and I was really happy because recently I actually came across some of those breakdowns, and I scanned them, and I was so happy because most of them I let go of, but I found an old briefcase with stuff from these days in it, and breakdowns, and the scripts were in there. I was like, yes, I have some. So you could see what I did and where I went with it. But years later, I'd worked with Keith on The Authority. And one of the nicest, and everybody respected that Keith is a brilliant storyteller, including me. But one of the nicest things is in the script, he wrote a fight sequence with Midnighter, and he said, I'm not going to break down what Darick needs to do. He knows what he's doing. So I'm just going to say, make him fight these guys for 3 pages and go. And I like to get that level of trust from Keith Giffen after he was a guy that would like, I'll literally draw it out for you to just get 3 pages in the script to go, Darick, you know what you're doing. Have fun. That felt like one of those little things that if there's comics military awards, like
The
like a
Keith
general
Giffen
would wear, it's like
Trust medal here.
The Keith Giffen ribbon. There's.
Nice.
So yeah, that meant a lot to me. So because it really felt like I had graduated at that point to earn his respect and trust. So that was my first foray into DC. And then when at the time, what was kind of fun about comics in the early 90s is that if DC wanted you, then Marvel really wanted you. And if Marvel wanted you, then DC wanted you more. And they would compete for talent. And so Rob Liefeld was breaking in around the same time. He had just done Hawk and Dove. And Todd was just starting to show up in DC Comics. And, so what would become the Image Revolution was just getting its seeds in the ground just then.
Yeah.
And I met a lot of these guys when we were all just trying to, get our first big assignment. That was kind of a fun time to be in comics. And so I was still taking my Spider-Man stuff over to Marvel, and I managed to show my work to Bob Harris. And this is when I was in the middle of my Justice League Europe run. And he gave me an issue of Wolverine with Fabian Nicieza, and that was Wolverine 54.
Yep.
My very first Marvel comic, him fighting Shatterstar. And I was like, still to this day, I can't believe my first Marvel comic was Wolverine, because I dreamed that someday I'd work on X-Men. And I drew, if you look at my 1982, 1983 sketchbooks, it's all Wolverine, Nightcrawler, X-Men. There's page after page after page. I love those characters. Like they were like real people to me,
Yeah. It's funny because you're answering the next question I have on my notes here. I was like, so was Wolverine a big dream job for you? Nope. Yeah, you already covered that.
Well, but it was, and then later on when I would get to work on it with Rucka, then that was really where the dream came true for me, because I was actually getting to reboot him and do him like from his core. Like I wasn't just filling in on some issues. I was getting to be, we had a vision for the character that unfortunately so did the studios, and therefore my run on Wolverine was not what I hoped it would be. But
yeah,
I'm very proud that I got to work with Greg, and we did some really good stuff together.
Yeah, they wanted him closer to the movie version, as I understand it.
It wasn't just me. It was like an edict that came down on high, because at the time there was Ultimate X-Men, and he had like a goatee, and he was in different comics at the same time, but like Sean Chan would draw him like kind of lanky, and Bernie like more like Barry Windsor Smith style.
Okay.
And but Sam Keith would draw him like he was like a little ball of hair, and
yeah.
So and Frank Miller had his the big hair, and but everybody had brought their own vision to the character, so I was a little surprised that I wasn't getting to do that as well. I didn't understand. Yeah, I thought that was what I got hired to do, because they loved what I did with him in Punisher Wolverine, which is why they in that Punisher issues that Ennis wrote. So they like, we love how you do Wolverine. We're going to reboot the book with you, and then they ran the whole first issue with me inking myself, which was something I had really wanted to do for years. And they ran it all in Wizard, and apparently Wizard was a big thing at the time, but they ran the whole first issue in Wizard magazine, not just a preview, but the whole first issue, where some people thought, well, nobody's going to buy it if you can have it free. It sold like crazy. So I couldn't, we were the #1 launch book for that time. And I'm like, how do I defend what I'm doing better than #1? Like if I'm like, I can't do better than #1. Like, how do I defend that this vision is hitting the audience the right way?
Yeah.
And I loved it because Rucka had a great concept, which was, look, we know what Wolverine does when he's wearing the costume and hanging out with the X-Men, because there's all these different comic books about that. But every once in a while, Logan would get on his motorcycle and disappear for a while. What's he doing when he does that? And that's what our stories were about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like he just needs to go get his head clear. And so but he'd find himself in the middle of things, and that's why the Brotherhood was such a fun opening story, because, here he is breaking up a cult of sex traffickers. And, and then also Rucka took a more philosophical view of Wolverine's claws, that he was like a samurai. And there's a thing with the samurai that you don't take the blade out unless it's got blood on it when it goes back. And we both kind of hated the fact that, Wolverine was at that time, opening beers with a claw or cutting off the end of a cigar with a claw, because the claws hurt. And one of the good things about the movie is that they mention when the claws come out, it's painful, breaks the skin, So he wouldn't do that. And so Rucka was like, let's tease the claws until issue 5. I'm like, oh, I love that. And that if it comes out, it it's
means
on.
something.
So we build up to it meant something. We built up to the claws finally being out and him finally going berserk. And God, I love that kind of storytelling and that intensity. And so, I wish that we had been allowed to kind of just run with what we wanted to do longer, but they had different ideas, and the character was so popular at the time that, it made me realize at a young age that, the top of the mountain wasn't the top of the mountain. And that as much as I'm so grateful that I got that opportunity at Marvel, that it would never be my character. Like Wolverine never would belong to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I can love him as much as, any other fan does. And I remember getting in an argument online back in a forum back in the day where someone was like, look, I don't like the way you draw Wolverine because you make him too short and too ugly and and I'm Wolverine's #1 fan. I go, no, dude. I loved Wolverine so much that I know that he's 5'3" and I know everything about him. And I loved him so much. I worked my ass off and I'm the guy on the comic. I win. I'm a bigger fan than you. I'm drawing him for a living. That's how much I love Wolverine. I'm a fan at heart.
We veered off the timeline there, talking as much as we did about his early 2000s work on Wolverine, but next episode, we'll go back in time once again, starting with his acclaimed run on The New Warriors, where I first discovered his work. Be sure to come back next week for that. Once again, thank you to Darick for taking the time to sit down over Zoom and talk with me. Remember, if you want to hear the uncut version of this, where we talk a little bit about our personal history and discuss the state of comic book conventions, plus multiple visits from my cat Londo, among other digressions, you can join the Patreon for just $1 per month at patreon.com/welcome to Geektown. If you want a free way to help the show out, leaving a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts or other podcast site is always appreciated. But no matter what, as long as you continue to listen, we'll always say,
welcome to Geektown. Population, us.
Questions for the Welcome to Geektown interviews are written by me, Kurt Onstead. I also host, edit, and produce the podcast. Theme song was written by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Senten.